Hello, it's Scott Arthur again, and welcome to Class 6C. And here we continue our look at different sustainable urban drainage system assets. So last time we looked at, amongst other things, permeable pavements and also green roofs. This time we start by looking at filter strips and swales. So here we go. So one of the underlying principles is that we use devices inspired by natural systems. Sloping vegetated areas are a good example of this. So that's our filter strip. These can be a strip of ground that the water runs across, or a broad shallow channel, a swale, that the water runs along when it has been raining. Filter strips are a type of source control which would allow direct infiltration, whereas swales are both conveyance and source control. So normally we expect these devices to be dry. So this scenario here isn't untypical of the one we have in the image, where we have some sort of road surface or a car park here, and then we have the filter strip downstream. When we do in Class 6D, the case study I'll show you there, what we have is we have the road surface, we have the filter strip sloping away, and that feeds into a swale at the bottom, and that works relatively well. The detail in here is good because we've got an edge to the road, so it means, or quite often on the edge of the road where these things can start to disintegrate a little, so it's good to have a hard edge there. And there's also a lip, a pronounced lip, which comes down. What you'll see in the example I give in 6D, and hopefully I'm not spoiling too many surprises here, is that the grass edge goes right up to the edge of the road, then slopes down to a swale. The issue is that I think that either the way it was built or perhaps due to the way it's been maintained, that there does tend to be a little lip of earth at the edge, so it means that essentially you get ponding. So it's that detail is quite important to get these things right. You'll see that in the next one. The picture here is a more typical example of a swale. You know, well, I say typical, it's the stereotypical, where you have flow being conveyed from upstream using a swale directly to a pond or a basin. Unfortunately, quite a lot of often what we see is ponds which are fed by pipe networks, so your inlet is a pipe structure, but the stereotypical textbook example is your pond being fed by swale. So we expect, as the flow crosses these surfaces, we expect it to be filtered a little by the grass and other vegetation, and we also expect some sedimentation. And remember, whenever we're talking about sediments themselves are pollutants, but it tends to be that there are hydrocarbons, etc., are also attached to those sediment particles. Okay, so a couple of swale devices here. So here we have a swale that you can see there's one upstream, it then discharges to this one, and then down to this outlet here. A couple of things about this. Often this kind of swale, where basically you've got a cascade where one feeds the other and there's an interruption in the middle. Sometimes the interruption in the middle can form a bund. So whilst it is a swale because you've got conveyance, you could argue it's also really just a cascade of basins, depending on how they're used. These are this one here is it's quite wide, but it's quite well maintained, and I'm sure that if the grass wasn't so well mown, it would look a little bit more natural, perhaps with flowers and things growing. It tends to be that along, if you try to maintain it like this, just grassy, it tends to be that along the bottom of it, where you get the sediment depositing happening, you don't get much growth there, or perhaps it's just a bit grubby. So a more naturalised look often means you get a better overall aesthetic. So This obviously takes up a bit of space, but normally that space would have been taken up perhaps by a grass verge, so you could argue it's just a different form of grass verge. Two things with that, viewing this as a grass verge though, is planners like to plant trees in grass verges, and they also like to put lampposts in grass verges, and obviously that's a little bit harder with these, so that is a bit of a constraint. The one on the left, obviously it's much shorter version of what's on the right. Perhaps in the longer term it'll be slightly better aesthetics once it's a bit more established, perhaps a bit more natural looking. But you can see here, even though it's much smaller, you do have the weir walls acting as a bund to give you extra storage there. So again, you could argue that this is actually a group of small basins rather than simply a swale. We have swales on campus in Hereford University, quite a few of them actually. So here the water is washed off the road surface, goes through a straight pipe, which is kind of like that, to the bottom of the swale, and then the flow continues down to a pond, which is just at the other side of the road there. I showed you a picture of that pond in the previous class. One of the issues with this setup is the grass tends to, because there's no apron for the water to discharge to, so grass tends to overgrow the outlet and eventually lead to it being blocked. So it's not a very good detail, but by and large these swales mostly work, but most people who are familiar with the campus will know there's one or two spots where it does tend to result in the road being inundated with water, because one of these inlet pipes on one particular section do tend to block. Much more naturalised swale. This one's in Dunfermline, actually not that far away from where my mum lives, which is quite coincidental. And you can see this one has a much more natural look. We've got the autumn leaves just depositing in swale, and it looks okay to me. If you like well manicured grass, mown to 12mm or whatever your desire is, you perhaps don't like this, but semi-natural looks okay to me. So infiltration devices. So rain falling on undeveloped sites do not normally result in runoff. Water seeps into the soil and percolates to the ground beneath. So that's really what infiltration devices are about, and if you remember back to class 6B, we talked about permeable surfaces, and so they're really, the focus of them is infiltration. So infiltration devices make use of the ability of soil and underlying geology to absorb water. These devices have two functions. They encourage infiltration by having large surface areas to drain the water through. Bingo, that's your permeable paving again. And they have some storage capacity to retain water when the intensity of the rainfall exceeds the infiltration capacity. Sorry about poor grammar on that slide. So here's a good infiltration device here. So this is on the right here we have subsurface storage being installed. So you see the white is a geotextile which is placed below it, which stops the underlying soil and looks like a sandy soil base the thing's been constructed on from infiltrating into the device and filling it up. And these devices basically work like the reinforced concrete storage tanks we covered in earlier lectures, but the geotextile, because it's permeable, allows, rather than this thing simply filling up and then passing water downstream, they fill up and then slowly infiltrate into ground after. So you could take flows from, road surfaces, from your rooftops, perhaps even from a car park, discharge it to this device, and we can let it slowly infiltrate. If you're on the Edinburgh campus, the grid building has one of these. It's just to the, let me get this right, just to the east of the building. There's a piece of ground there, and you'll see there's one or two manholes. What's below those manholes is one of these. I was quite excited to see that when it was being installed. So the great thing about these devices, these so-called geocellular devices, is that, if you like, the closest comparator is the sort of filter trench, infiltration trench, which are filled with crushed rock, and we've got a void ratio there of about 0.3, 0.4. With your geocellular devices, you normally end up with a void ratio of well above 0.9, so you've got about 90% volume there. You've not got reinforced concrete, you've not got reinforced steel, you've not got reinforcing steel, so hopefully you've got a lower carbon footprint, and because it's permeable, you've got infiltration as well. So they're reasonably good devices. There's problems with earlier ones, as you can see in this picture here. It's a suboptimal situation, I guess you would say, where people are a bit optimistic about their strength and what loads they could carry, and there was quite a few failures like this. So I think now they're much more established and much more rigorous products. The other thing that's changed is there's now, you can see through the circular hole on the side here, there's now much better access to these to clean out any silt which does accumulate within them, because that is a function of them, obviously, is to accumulate that silt. So infiltration trenches. So these are like in the previous slide we talked about filter drains along the side of the road. Infiltration trenches are very similar to them, but the difference is where our filter drain, remember that was the trench and filled with stone at the side of the road, and we had the pipe at the bottom. The water came and was fully stone, of course. Let's do the stone particle thing. Oh, that looks like a face, doesn't it? Stop it looking like a face. Water comes in, it gets stored between the stones, gets filtered, and eventually makes its way to its drain, and it's passed downstream, maybe to a basin or a pond. Infiltration trenches are exactly the same, but around the edge we allow infiltration, whereas filter trenches tend to be sealed with a membrane. Infiltration trenches is just sealed, is bounded by a geotextile, and we allow infiltration. So infiltration trench is a gravel-filled trench designed to infiltrate stormwater into the ground. The volume of stormwater runoff is diverted into the trench where it infiltrates into the surrounding soil. Bingo. Infiltration trenches can be used to remove suspended solids, particulates, bacteria, organics and soluble metals and nutrients through a mechanism of infiltration, absorption and microbial decomposition. Okay. They're also useful to provide groundwater recharge and to increase base flow levels in nearby streams. As with all infiltration practices, the possibility for groundwater contamination exists and must be considered where groundwater is a source of drinking water. So that's particularly an issue where you've got quite polluted runoff levels, or where the ground you're building on is perhaps contaminated, and you don't want all this infiltration water going through your device to mobilise those pollutants which are in the soil. So these are excellent linear devices. You can see the device in this picture, pretty sure the picture's done D. The device in the picture is just under the kerb there. If you look carefully, the kerb has holes along the edge of it, and that's these things here. It comes in, it's stored in the stone mass in those voids, and then slowly infiltrates into the ground. The size of this thing, obviously, just like the permeable pavement subgrade, is based on your expected inflow and also the rate of infiltration. So if you've got a slow infiltration rate, you have to allow more storage because you're going to have to hold that flow back as it slowly infiltrates. The vertical pipe is a bit of a detail. You don't have too many of these. This is just really for inspection. So In the longer term, you might be concerned about the thing clogging and not infiltrating quickly enough. So your inspection chamber allows you just to have a look down to see if there's water in it. So if there's always water in it, it tells you that perhaps there's a problem, and you have to investigate what the source of that problem is. So there's the infiltration trench design is covered by this guidance here. I've needed to update that to the new SUDS manual, but the new SUDS manual uses the same approach. So the first step is to apply a factory safety to the work. So, and this is based on the damage which would result from a failure. So failure is like it fills up and overflows. So no damage, no damage or inconvenience, factory safety 1.5. More limited minor damage to external areas or inconvenience, factory safety between 2 and 5. Where you expect there to be damage to buildings or major inconvenience, you've got a factory safety of 10. Right, I'm going to talk you through the design feature here, and then I'll show you the equations we used to do this. So the focus of the design is to determine the depth of the trench required based on a given length and breadth. So this is important. So if you remember, so really you're installing these things either on roads or car parks typically. Other places are possible, obviously. So if you have a car park and it's sloping that way, where are you going to put the trench? It's a tough one, isn't it? You're going to put the trench here. Okay, so when it comes to that first point about determining length, if it's a car park, that's the kind of thing you're thinking about. You're thinking, well, where we're going to collect is water, and that defines your length. If you're doing a road, obviously it's the entire length of the road. Now the breadth of the trench, that's really just a matter of choice. So obviously you want it to be wider than the size of the excavator bucket you expect to be working with, but you don't want it to be too wide, because then you start to consume too much land. So a good place to start is perhaps a metre. So you determine the infiltration rate for the soil and the design location. So that's using your site survey information. This can vary from 1,000 millimeters per hour for gravel, so that's pretty high, down to almost nothing for clay. The rates below 0.05 are normally not suitable, because that means your device is going to have to be so big because of the temporary storage requirement that it's not that economically viable. So in that situation, if you want to do this kind of thing, that's where you would use a filter drain. And there you're certain, you assume the infiltration is not happening, collect the water in your filter drain, you've got some filtration, and then you would pass it downstream to a basin or whatever. Obtain Q, the infiltration coefficient, by dividing the infiltration rate by the factory safety, and the factory safety was in the previous slide. Determine the porosity of the granular material. So this is normally between 0.2 to 0.5. So the porosity is basically the volume of voids within the material. So porosity is of 0.5 means that the material is 50% air once it's in situ. Determine the area to be drained and choose the dimensions of the trench. So the area to be drained, that doesn't necessarily just have to be the volume of your car park or the volume of your road. You could be expecting some flow from additional areas. And then choose the dimensions of your trench. We spoke about the length of the car park, along the side of the road, etc. And the perimeter of the trench. So that's should be relatively easy for you guys to do. So that's, yeah. And then a range of storm durations and associated intensities. So what we have here, what we do is for each of those durations and intensities, we calculate H max. So if what you end up with is a curve, which is duration, and H, my goodness, this isn't easy to write, H max, and what you should end up with is a curve that goes like that, and that's your H max. Okay, so H max is the depth of the trench you pick. So you pick a duration, you pick a range of storm durations, you plot these against H max, and that should give you the trench that you need. Okay, straightforward, I think. So rather than calculating A and B, it is also possible to use these curves, which B times D against A, and that can also give you H max. So now what you have to think about is that the final check in the design is how long it takes to half empty, because this device might be able to accommodate a storm one day, but what you want to know is, well, if it rains the next day, is it going to be able to drain? Is there going to be capacity available for that rain the next day? And so really the check there is whether or not does it half empty within 24 hours. And so this equation, because it's a 3D device, why it's called a 3D device is that the plane infiltration system, that doesn't just mean dull, it means it's a planar system and it's flat. 3D system, you allow for infiltration on the walls of the device. Some approaches for 3D infiltration assume that the base of the device becomes blinded quite quickly because of the sediment might tend to accumulate there, so you lose your infiltration capacity there, but you maintain it along the sides. So you run that check. Okay, so if there's an example here, I've provided rainfall data and the equations for you, so please have a go at this one, and I'm happy to give you feedback on your attempts. So moving on to ponds, including the Edinburgh one in the picture here. So these are areas of open water which mimic natural drainage pattern. Okay, basins are temporary water features. They only fill with water during and after storms. Between periods of rainfall, basins can be used for other activities. So there's one quite near where I live, which is a sports field, and it can fill up during quite extreme rainfall events. It's actually, rather than being from a drainage system, no, it's filled by a small local water course. Ponds are permanent water bodies. There are many different names for these devices depending on their intended main use. Both attenuation flows and they both attenuate flows and treat runoff. They also provide amenity and allow for infiltration. So I think more than any other such device, I think such ponds are the ones which provide amenity, and the ones which I think, if you're being creative about your development and how you want to include suds in your development, I think they offer the greatest potential, personally. So this is our pond. During dry weather, you'd expect there to be some water in it, and your storage capacity is provided as it rains, and the level begins to increase in the pond. Okay, so you've not your pond water level doesn't stay constant all the time. It's about increasing during those rainfall events. typically you'll have a liner level, which means that your flow, you don't have infiltration above that liner level, but during your storm event it fills beyond that, and then what you want to happen is for then to have infiltration in that zone. Okay, so as I said, these can offer actually quite high immunity to developments, and as I said in the previous lecture, or perhaps 2 lectures ago, these are not new things, they are around, so they are features that people are used to in urban environments and often value, where they're surge ponds or man-made ponds. Actually, I mean, quite a lot of ponds in urban areas, no matter how long they've been there for, are either man-made, from a long time ago, certainly in the UK, or receive surface water inputs in some form, either directly or indirectly. Surfaces historically are connected to the inflows to them. So it's actually quite hard in a UK context to find a pond which is, in an urban area, but which is wholly natural. So this is a typical pond design where you have your inlet. It's typically reinforced in some way so it doesn't just become a muddy mess as the flow comes in. You've got your outlet structure, and then if your pond is bunded, you've got an overflow as well, because what you don't want to happen is, if you do get to the stage where your pond is full and it's a bunded structure, if it begins to overflow, there's a danger you'll get erosion there and it may collapse. So you have to be careful. Some urban drainage ponds can become so big that they technically are considered to be reservoirs, and you have to be quite careful about how they're designed and considering the impact of failure. So this slide was this diagram was the initial sort of generic pond layout. A few years ago, when I think Sewers for Scotland and the SUDS manual was revised, this was a generic layout that was adopted, where you still have the same basic configuration I was talking about. You've got your inlet with the erosion control, the reinforcing. You've got your spillway if it's a bundled structure, and you've got your outlet. Now the difference here is there is an emphasis on having the submerged berm that goes through the middle of it. And now the idea behind this is that as the flow comes into your pond in here, is that this part of the pond here does a lot of the work in terms of encouraging the sedimentation of the larger particles, and the idea is that that's where most of the sediment particles will accumulate. So it means when it comes to maintaining them, you can focus on that area much more regularly than the rest of the pond. So I think there's some sense in that, which is good. There is an encouragement to make your pond a regular shape, because I think that's to try and give it a much more natural look. But depending on how you've planned your site, that might not be something that you see necessarily as being advantageous. Now there is lots of stories about how, this picture has been used quite widely to encourage pond designs, and so have other generic designs have been used. And there is lots of tales of how there's ponds, lots of them look just like this one, because engineers just take this shape and think, well, this shape must be acceptable, so that's the one I'm going to use. And I'm never sure how true it is, but people say that these designs are replicated without too much thought in a lot of places. Now, one of the things about this kind of design is what you want is for the water to flow through your pond and for all of the volume to be used, because it's about maximising the time during more extreme events, the time individual packets of flow remain in the pond, because the longer it's in the pond, the more likely that the sediment that flow is carrying will deposit out. Now, if I was going to be, so a good example is this pond here. So the flow is basically coming in here, and it's having to travel a fair distance to get through, which is quite good. Obviously, you could have a really long narrow pond in its extremity, and then that would maximise your residence time, but it perhaps doesn't give you something that looks that natural. A problem might be with this shape of pond is you've got this area up here, which may turn out to be a bit of a dead zone depending on how the flow goes through the pond. So you've got lots of flow going through, taking its time to go through. But if the main flow path isn't really interrupting this area at the top here, so stagnant's the wrong word, but there's not much flow exchange or circulation within that area, then whilst it's perfectly acceptable to have an area like that, and that could provide quite viable habitat, etc., you would be wrong to include that when you're working out, if you're working at residence times, or perhaps thinking more deeply about treatment. So areas like that are perfectly acceptable, but if there's no flow circulation, then you're not benefiting there from residence times, so you might have to make your pond slightly longer or slightly wider to try and counteract that. So you can have that, but you shouldn't really involve that in your calculations. Basins. So infiltration basins retain water above ground, which soaks into the ground through the base of the basin. The ground therefore should not become compacted. You see this one's got drains installed in the base to try and support that infiltration happening. Another one here, you can see there's actually some water sitting in this one. This one's at Tesco in Dunfermline, and you can see it's a basin there. A bit of an aside, you can see in last week's class, well, so class 6B, we're talking about permeable car park surfaces and how the parking bays often have the block paving and permeable surfaces, whereas the roads around the car park are asphalt. And you can see that design here. It looks like you've got large segments of permeable block paving, which are serviced by asphalt roads. Okay, so that's a good example of what we're talking about the other day. And that's another suds pond adding value to a development there, which is good. So this basin is one of my favourite basins. It's in Dunfermline, and it's right in the middle of the roundabout there. And the good thing about that one is that the land there has absolutely no value. So nobody's going to build a house there or anything like that. So putting the basin in the middle of that is good, I would say. But then thinking about the bigger picture, maybe there's two problems. What if there's an accident and a car overshoots one of the access roads and ends up in the middle and it's fully water? It's not so good. And the other issue is, remember, we always think about exceedance. So when that basin fills up and begins to overflow, is it going to cause disruption to road users? Something else you might want to think about. But otherwise, I think it's a good use of land that doesn't have any real value. Another basin in Dunfermline. So when we're designing our pond, we have to make sure it's got the volume to deal with, or our basin, we have to make sure it's got the volume to deal with the storm flows, so we don't have any flooding. So that's the volume of flow we'd expect from that 1 in 30 year event for the critical storm duration. So that's quite a large volume. And now that event on average only comes along once every 30 years, but nonetheless your pond has to be designed to accommodate that, and your basin as well, and we also have to think about what would happen under exceedance situations. So that's one thing. But the vast majority of the rainfall events your pond will deal with will be much smaller than that, But what they will be doing is washing pollutants off the catchment surface into the pond, and your pond is expected to treat them. So whilst the ponds, it's a big job, the once in a lifetime for it is to deal with that 1 in 30 year event. The rest of the time is dealing with these quite mundane events which have carrying quite a lot of pollutants. So by and large what you want to do is ensure that your pond can accept, broadly speaking, the worst rainfall event on average you would get in a year without really passing forward too much flow. And this is where this calculation here comes in. So at the bottom of your pond, so you've got a pond, look at that, it's that shape. The bottom of your pond is always wet, and I remember I was saying earlier that your pond might have a liner, so your liner to stop infiltration goes round up to that level, and it's only really above that you get infiltration. So up to that level it's called the permanent pool, because the flow is in there permanently, more or less. Now the permanent pool can be there's no upper limit on what size the permanent pool can be, and it's recognised that by and large the bigger that permanent pool is, the better your pond is at treating runoff, removing those solids from it, which is good. So I think a rough rule of thumb is 3 to 4 times, or perhaps, well, certainly about around 3 times the worst rainfall event you would expect in a typical year. You would hope your permanent pool would be around that size, and if it's that size it would do a pretty good job at cleaning the flow. But there is a minimum size you shouldn't go below, and that's called the treatment volume, and the calculation here is to estimate the treatment volume. Now this equation, it's full of parameters we've seen already. So we've got D, which is the M560 rainfall depth, our soil classification index, and I is the fraction of area which is impervious. Now what's interesting about this equation is it's not really interesting. It's the equation. This equation was when SUDs were first promoted in Scotland. There was a site in Scotland called DEX, which is Dunfermline Eastern Expansion, and as part of that, they had to think about how they were going about designing these things. So they did think about, well, we need to design our pond so that it can accommodate most rainfall events we'd expect in a year without passing anything forward. They had a bit of a look at research to see what was good treatment, what was poorer treatment, and almost magically the person that was doing this came up with this equation. So he wrote a paper about this equation, talking about how he'd used it to design these ponds in Dunfermline, and he said that the equation was based on work which was presented in another paper. So we'll call the paper he was writing paper A, and the other paper he said the equation was based on was in paper B. Now, so if you go to paper B talks about the use of the equation, and it says the equation was derived in paper A. So the long shot of this is that nobody really knows what the basis for this equation is, but most people think it kind of works okay, and it's been used for best part of 20 years now, I think, so people kind of stick with it. But it's not an equation which has much basis in reality. And in fact, you might want to think about how, if you've done wastewater treatment design, about the focus we'll have on residence times inside treatment devices and wastewater treatment works, and how important that is. You might want to think about, well, why don't we use the same approach to design ponds? But in the UK we don't. We use this VT equation, which is quite interesting. So this gives you the VT volume. So for your basin, you want to be sure that it can accommodate VT without passing any flows downstream. For your pond, it's the same, but you tend to multiply it up based on the pollutant load of the upstream network. This is in the next slide, I think. Yeah. So here we go. So if you're receiving water course sensitivity is low, so that means it's not particularly good water quality course, the contributing, so you're also don't expect polluted loads coming into the pond, and there is upstream devices, you could get away with your treatment volume being less than 1 VT, although that would be really unusual to do that. Then if we upgrade that to there being no treatment devices upstream, and you've got low pollutant potential, you'd expect to stick to 1 VT. If you've got a sensitive stream and you've got a higher likelihood of pollutants entering the pond, you would then want to factor your VT up. So it says there to a factor between 2 and 4 should be agreed with the environmental regulator. So basically, in most circumstances, you're taking that VT figure, and that's just a starting point, and then you're multiplying that up. The important thing to remember, though, is that the VT value is just the permanent pool. That's the minimum limit for the permanent pool, and in terms of the cost of your pond, a lot of the cost in the pond is about the land it takes up and the sheer volume of water you have to be able to store for that 1 in 30 year event. So that's usually the bigger demand on you as compared to getting this VT calculation just right. So the additional cost of, whether it's 2, 3 or 4 VT in a lot of cases is going to be quite marginal compared to being able to accommodate that 1 in 30 year storm. We also have to think about attenuation. Your pond has to be designed so that it passes forward no more than the greenfield runoff rate for any equivalent storm. So what that means is for a 1 year return period event, your pond can't pass forward anything more than typically the greenfield equivalent of that storm, and likewise for the 1 in 30 year event, you wouldn't expect your pond to pass anything forward more than the 1 in 30 greenfield equivalent runoff rate. It's also important that the pond should be able to drain down to the permanent pool level in a reasonable time, so we're half empty within 24 hours, so that it can handle the next event, similar to what we discussed for filter drains. So this is a idealised picture of what that might look like, but we'll cover outlet devices in class 7, so don't get too uptight about it just now. So we've got a pond, it has a treatment volume in it, and that treatment volume should be equal or less than the permanent pool volume. And we've also got after a 1 year event, it might fill up to that level, but we don't expect our outlet to pass anything forward more than the 1 year greenfield runoff rate. Likewise, the 30 year, we don't expect it to pass anything more forward than the 30 year runoff rate. And if we're going to 100, similarly. Okay. We'll talk, this is idealised, we'll talk more about how we do this in the next class. And I've covered this point earlier actually about how it's normal to design the pond to maximise residence times. Remember I talked about the dead zone that might be here. So this is an example for you to do. I think it's based on the one we did earlier in the session, class, forget the class number. So what you want to do now is think about try to estimate the pond's permanent pool volume. Okay. I think something I should have said actually is that if we look at VT, it's important to remember that VT is it's meters cubed per hectare of contributing area. Okay, so it's not a volume, it's a volume per hectare. Okay, so there should be everything you need there to have a go at calculating VT. Obviously for this one what we've got is a pipe network draining to a pond, which is not ideal because we've not got an upstream drainage network, sludge network, sorry, treatment drain, so you might want to think about factoring up the VT to try to accommodate and deal with, manage those pollutants. And there's rainfall data there for doing that. Okay, so that brings class 6C to an end. That essentially wraps up the class 6. Class 6D is still to come, but it's really just a case study. I've not recorded it yet, but it should just be, I'm thinking sort of 10 or 15 minutes to get through, and it's really just about reinforcing some of the things that we spoke about in class 6A, class 6B, class 6C. But please have a look at that, and it hopefully get you thinking about some of the wider issues and not just the detail that sometimes we all get fixated on. Okay, I spend a lot of time putting these lectures together. I know it probably doesn't seem like it, so I really do hope you appreciate the time I've invested in this. As ever, if you've got any questions, please just get in touch by email or using the discussion board on Vision, or if you're an on-campus student, we can chat about it in class, or you can come along and see me in my office. Okay, bye for now.